Hi, this is Mark Arnold with yet another episode of Fun Ideas Podcast. And today we have a returning guest who's going to help me interview our new special guest. Returning guest is Kamden Spies, and he and I are going to interview the wonderful Maggie Thompson. Yay!
Yay me.
How are you today, Maggie?
So far, well, the Norwegian saying, which they have around here, I was informed, is up and not crying. So my other usual response is from PG Woodhouse, which is so far so G. So here we go.
All right.
Both.
And I think you've probably lived in the same place forever, but where is that roughly? Not.
Central Wisconsin.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Waupaca County is central Wisconsin. And Don and I moved here in 1982 because Chet Krause hired us to work on two publications, one on movies and one on comics. So
Very cool.
we had done columns for those publications, and then he hired us to edit them once he bought them.
Hmm. Okay. All right, and I'll just kind of briefly show. I don't have all in color for a dime, but I know you do, and I know this is on audio, but I have the comic book, the sequel, and I have all in color for a dime, but I have mine in paperback. I've never found a cheap one in hardback that was also in good condition. So, and
Say this was in good condition, but
well,
yeah,
it even has plastic on it. And then I
same.
have Comic Buyer's Guide Comics Book Superstars. Wow. Anyway, so if you
Yeah,
want to see what those look like, go into the video version on YouTube. There we go. So now your daughter will be happy. Anyway.
exactly. So yeah, there we go. And I will say that I sort of checked myself on Wikipedia a couple days ago just to say, well, what is and isn't mentioned. And my daughter had mentioned that I should refer to the magazine that I created before we did Comics Buyer's Guide, which was Fantasy Empire, which was a magazine for new media urjax. And the concept there was because I had done columns on Doctor Who, that publisher wanted to do a publication in the US called Doctor Who Magazine. And I said, if you do that, they will break your knees. And but if we call it Fantasy Empire, and it is about fantasy and science fiction in the British Empire, and guess what will be on the cover? Oh, who will be on the cover every issue, etc. So that was one of my credentials for getting the job at Krause Publications.
Before we go any further, and then Camden can ask questions or whatever, usually I just start off as tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started. I mean, I know your basic story, but I like to hear it in the person's own words. So if you could kind of say how you met Dawn and how you got involved with comic books and everything like that, briefly.
So we're separated in time. So when I was three and a half, I had a dime allowance and I would take it. That was my total income. And I would buy a comic book on the newsstand. And I bought Animal Comics. And I couldn't read. So I was three and a half. So my mom read the stories to me, and she liked one of the stories so much that she showed it to my dad, and he liked it so much that they wrote a fan letter because they knew science fiction and what you do as a fan. And so they wrote to Walt Kelly, care of the Dell offices in New York, and he did not respond. And that's okay. They just said they wanted, they wanted more information. Let's face it, this is the 1940s. There wasn't a fandom to reach out to. And then a couple of issues later, Pogo, his character, has a panel where he says, "Hey, readers, do you like what we do? Send us a letter and tell us." And they wrote a second letter and said, "Well, we wrote you once already, but, yeah." And that time he responded. And it started a correspondence that ended up with them actually being friends. And a correspondence continued. They kept carbons of their letters from that point on. And obviously, you keep letters from Walt Kelly. And eventually, he wanted to do another strip. And mom was a science fiction writer you never heard of. And so they were putting it together to do a science fiction newspaper strip. and the Korean War broke out, and the syndicate said we don't want any satire at all. Period. Nope. So that fell through, but that started that whole environment that I grew up in, which is if you like something, you say thank you, and you're encouraged to read picture stories because there, as Harvey Pekar said, there's no limit to how good the words can be, no limit to how good the pictures can be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, then mom and dad were science fiction fans. I say mom was a pro. My first World Science Fiction Convention was 1955, so I was 12, and yeah. So in that world, just so you know, in science fiction, mom, um, her first contribution, her first submission was to the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and it was edited by Anthony Boucher. And she said, "Do you want me to use a pseudonym? Do you want me?" She said, "I can use a complete pseudonym. I can just use a first initial for my name." He said, "I want women to know that not only can they read science fiction, they can write science fiction." And he put her name on the cover.
Wow.
So that was the environment that I grew up in. Among the aspects of science fiction fandom is was frequently parties, meetings, hanging out together, sharing ideas, etc. And among the people that mom and dad would visit were Ed Hamilton and Lee Brackett in Kinsman, Ohio. So we were in Western Pennsylvania. Ed and Lee, so I don't know if you know who Ed Hamilton
I
and Lee Brackett were.
I've heard the names. I
Oh,
don't. I'm
well,
not
we
sure.
can we
Yeah.
can discuss that. I'm just saying major at that time.
Okay.
And they had told mom that they were going to have a picnic and she should come to the picnic. And what happened was we drove to Kinsman and there was nothing going on and they weren't even there, but his family lived across the road. And they, "Where is it?" And they said, "Oh, no, it's at Basil Wells's house in Pennsylvania, etc." So we went to that instead of giving up. And among the people there were Andre Norton, P. Schuyler Miller, Basil Wells, who was a writer, Ed and Lee. And there was this, they had announced it through the National Fantasy Fan Federation, which was basically a bunch of science fiction fans, that any N3F member would be welcome to attend. And there was this guy who'd hitchhiked there. And it was 1957, and the guy needed a ride home. So we took him part of the way, and my watch just said it sounded like I had a question. That's okay, I don't phone. The So this guy, we drove him. He was from Titusville area, but we drove him back as far as our house, and that guy then later sent me a letter about comics because we just talked pop culture that whole Saturday, and the guy's name was Don Thompson,
Wow.
and things
Wow.
happen. You see people, you meet people, you write letters, communication, podcasts. Now you have podcasts.
Right. Um, was it when you were connected to Dawn at first, was it a romantic way or was it just friendship at
Oh,
first? Okay, I was just curious.
absolutely. Just
Yeah, yeah, I didn't know
no,
if it was yeah, sparkly.
no, 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 no. It was just like
Yeah.
we talked pop culture before the term was invented. So we
Hmm.
talked about old time radio, which wasn't old time then.
It
We
was
talked
odd.
about comic books, comic strips, science fiction,
Uh,
movies. He'd seen movie serials in his theater, but I'd never seen movies, that kind of thing. And
mm,
yeah, no. And but we communicated our first communication was he sent me a copy of Harvey Kurtzman's Humbug #1,
mm.
and it was a comic book, and he just folded it in half and stuck it in a number 10 envelope and said, "Didn't know if you'd seen that." And so we, again, it was, we had been talking about Mad, etc. And no, and we just corresponded, and then every once in a while we'd get together, and eventually things happen. So yeah,
Very
yeah.
cool. Camden, do you have any questions or anything?
Yeah, when we're talking about Don Thompson, I do have a question about I was gonna pull up the book, but about All in Color for a Dime. I have the reissues of them because I found the reissues of them very quickly. They were just like they were I bought them from a seller who also had the Great Comic Book Heroes and Patrick McDowell's book on George Harriman, all wrapped and sealed from a store. They had them in like in a warehouse, and they were just in a store wrapped from when they got them. These were just wrapped up, so they hadn't.
That was the reissue that Krause Publications did after I started working at Krause. So if you look at the publisher on the back,
Mhm.
it's KP, that's Krause Publications, which went on to do Comics Buyer's Guide. So this was after we'd been doing Comics Buyer's Guide for a while, and we said, hey, why not re-release it? So yeah, that's the paperback that we did at Krause.
Are there any revisions to it, or is it identical to the first edition?
Pretty much I did.
Okay.
I would guess it was retypeset.
Yeah.
I don't know whether there were misspellings that were corrected after all these years. I would hope so if there were, but I don't know.
But there wasn't additional chapters or anything added or
No, no,
anything.
I
no.
Okay.
No.
Okay. That's what I want
Might,
to
that's a
know.
good question. What?
there is
Uh,
like intros in the beginning of the chapters, like from whoever wrote them.
hmm, says Maggie, looking at a copy of comic book. Oh, goodness. I literally haven't opened this for ages. No, I think, no, these were the introductions were in the original publication.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was interesting. I just discovered. So this is the second book. The first book
Yeah.
Uh,
was the articles that had run in Zero, uh, from Dick and Pat Lupoff, their science fiction fanzine, and that was what sort of started getting into comics fandom. There wasn't a comics fandom per se, but because Zero did All in Color for a Dime as a series of articles, I think we did the third. Uh, we did Marvel superheroes,
mhm.
as I recall. And when I say we, I mean my dad taught me how to cut mimeograph stencils. So Don wrote the article. I traced the art that went with it in the mimeographed fanzine.
Mm.
So that first one is, I think, all from, and you'll see that the editor, often Don Thompson. So they came together to do that. And I believe actually science fiction fan Terry Carr was an editor at a publishing company. And the deal was that they could do a paperback of All in Color for a Dime if it was first published in hardcover. And so Arlington House published the hardcover. I am not giving you short answers, I've just realized. If you would like me to be a little more brief, I would be pleased to do that.
Okay. I do have a question based on there was no fandom back then, but since there's other fans that started way back when, like Roy Thomas or Bill Shelley or somebody, people like that, did you know or know of any of those people back in those days, or is everybody like their own little island around the U.S. and whatever?
Well, we were depends on who it was and who was in contact with whom. So Jerry Bales and Roy Thomas did Alter Ego.
Right.
Now, think about that name. Think about
Ba
the name of their fanzine,
Alter Ego. Yeah.
Alter
Mhm.
Ego. What's its focus going to be?
Superheroes.
Superheroes.
Got it. So that was their focus. Our publication, which came out almost simultaneously with that, was called Comic Art. Guess what our focus was?
More
Strips. And
the funny stuff, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Comic art, art for
Yeah.
comics. And in fact, Jerry tried to come up with a term for comics fans that didn't use the word comic. So he called it panelology, which for some reason didn't catch on. But but our focus was animated cartoons, magazine cartoons, comic books, comic strips, etc. And because we had the luxury, so this was also true of Jerry and Roy, but we had the luxury of being grown-ups, whereas most of the readers at the time were kids.
Mm.
But when we would write a fan letter to a publisher or a cartoonist or a comics artist, we got responses. And so our contributors, our letter writers, we would do the address withheld from several of our letter writers. So people like Ed Whelan, uh, whom you probably don't. Well, our second cover featured Crockett Johnson, whose
Hmm.
Barnaby comic strip was one of the all-time most wonderful comic strips. And his criticism was that we shouldn't call it a fanzine, we should call it a fan mag, because if you look at the roots of the word, fan mag would be more correct than fanzine. And then we had a letter, I think a couple of issues later, from somebody calling it. He said, "I just got your fanzine." Ha ha, there, Crockett. So yeah, it was that sort of relationship. A lot of professionals were kind enough to indulge us and respond and criticize and so forth.
Hmm.
And
So
then I you mentioned comic art, and I've been writing this thing for Jerry Beck for his Cartoon Research article about all of that all the most of the histories of comic strips before 1970, any kind of book that was on them always had animation as a chapter in comic strip history, which I found completely fascinating.
Stephen Becker's Comic Art in America, if you look at the reference works that we
Mhm.
had as resources, there were almost none. So there was a book called The Comics. There was uh, the I mean the various one. There was one about writers and artists, etc. The best, the most
Comics and
widely
their creators.
circulated one was Stephen Becker's Comic Art in America, which got some facts wrong, but geez Louise, I mean, come on. Yeah.
Yeah, comic art in America. I found it interesting because Mark, you might remember this about the book. The animation chapter, about two-thirds of it is on Terry Tunes.
Yeah. The only thing I can think of in connection to what you're saying is a lot of the early comic book artists that didn't work on superhero stuff tended to come directly from the animation industry. They'd moonlight on the comic books and other things. So, it certainly was true at
I mean, a
Harvey.
lot of
Yeah. All the
Also
Paramount
depended on
famous.
it also depended on where they lived.
Yep.
It also depended on World War II and what happened. Because, for example, Walt Kelly tried to enlist and was rejected. So he stayed stateside, but people like Dan Noonan, various of his Morris Golub, they were in the armed forces, and he continued to correspond because he worked with them at Disney, but then those guys got drafted.
Hmm.
So, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but in Poughkeepsie, Western printing and lithographing was where Dell was. And they tended to aim their comics at a younger age, whether deliberately or not. But that is noted. Animal Comics, which is what I got my Pogo from, but they also did Christmas with Mother Goose, Easter with Mother Goose. Those were entirely by Kelly, who got to sign his name there. The flip side of that was people like um, um, let's face it, Barks. So Carl Barks never was permitted to sign his name to anything that he had done in the Disney stuff. And then our last issue, we wanted to do an issue in which we discussed Carl Barks and his work and his biography and so forth. And we wrote to Disney to ask for permission to reproduce some of his work, just photocopy, it wasn't photocopy then, but anyway, the
Stats. Yeah.
stats. And by the way, cutting mimeograph stencils, I
True,
can do
true.
that. And the Disney responded, not only do you not have permission to use the art, we don't want you to do the issue at all,
Wow.
because the children of America think that Walt Disney writes and draws all the comic books that have his name on it, and we don't want to disappoint the children of America.
Yeah, that was my comment on the thing I'm writing for Jerry because, like, for example, Martin Sheridan's comics and their creators has Walt Disney as a chapter, and I'm like, this doesn't really work this way because it's written like he's like in the same way Chester Gould would be written, which I'm like, this is really confusing.
Well,
Yeah.
did other authors like the one Camden mentioned, did they have to seek out permission from Disney at that time? And what time are we talking about?
Nobody who worked at Disney.
When were you doing that issue, that Karl Barks issue?
Well, what happened was Disney died.
Yeah.
So he wrote again. And they
Hmm.
said, oh, sure.
No. Okay, so originally Walt was still around. So is Walt
Yeah,
gonna
exactly. Yep.
putting the screws on, which is interesting because I'm currently living in Oregon, and University of Oregon has the Ducks, and it was just apparently a handshake deal. Oh yeah, you can use Donald Duck
Yeah,
with Walt, and it wasn't
I
until years later that Eisner came around and looked. There's no paperwork on this.
I did this whole piece for Jerry, which was like a four-parter, which was like schools that you should just send letters to people that they would just be like, yeah, sure, here's the art, and it wouldn't cost them any money. Like the biggest example is like there's a high school in Indiana that uses Felix the Cat,
Oh,
and they had been using Felix the Cat since the 1920s, to where it's a handshake deal with like Pat Sullivan. So like there's that goes back so far that if I guess whoever owns the Felix trademark wanted to do anything about it, they really can't. They could, but I
there's
wouldn't
a
try.
difference between owning the art and using the art in something you're publishing. That's when you have to get permission. There's also the concept of fair use. So if you quote a sentence or a paragraph, that's fair use. If you did a book that was entirely the contents of the output, you can't. And I actually I attended. Thanks, Chet Krause sent me to a copyright seminar because Chet didn't know. And so before Krause Publications bought Buyer's Guide and the film publication, they had already come up with a magazine devoted to comics. It was called, I think it was Comic Collector. And when we were interviewing for the job, the publisher said, "What do you think about this?" and shows us the issue. And Don looked at it and said, "I think it needs a trademark and a copyright on the image of Superman you're using on the cover." And they didn't know that.
Wow.
So years later, somebody was doing something. They said, "Oh, well, if you run into problems, they'll send you a cease and desist letter. And that's all you have to worry about." And I said, "Krause Publications already has a cease and desist letter. Thank you very much because of that issue." It's so, yep, man. The interesting world.
When did Michael Barrier's Carl Barks issue of Funny World come out?
Oh gosh, later.
Was that before Disney died or
That was
afterwards?
after. That was
That
in the
was after.
70s.
That
I
was
think
after.
it was in the 70s sometime. I don't remember the exact year, but
Okay, so Mike, and it was funny because he's became an attorney, and we said Mike Barrier. I mean, isn't that a superhero? I'm just saying, at least a
Yeah.
Batman type. And but at one point when I was I put together a little booklet of my involvement with Walt Kelly, and so I did a little. It's just basically done on a computer, but it's with some of the images because it contains some of the correspondence. And I've scanned the whole frickin' correspondence. But in this particular case, um, it seemed, uh, I mean, whatever. And now I've absolutely lost the frame of what we're talking. Oh, that was it. I said to Mike Barrier, I said, "Well, I've got the correspondence that they did later because Mom kept carbons of the later letters. But the early letters," they said, "of course, I don't have the first couple of letters that they wrote. I haven't seen those because what the heck?" And Mike said, "You haven't seen them? I've seen them." And I said, "What?" And yeah, Walt Kelly's papers got donated to Ohio State University. And yes, and those letters are there because Walt kept them.
very
Walt
cool.
kept huge amounts of correspondence. And so I contacted them, and he'd seen them where the word copy, 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 copy was over all the scans so that nobody could take the letters. And I said, "Well, I guess technically I own the copyright to my parents' letters." So I now have copies of the first two letters. First one written to Mr. Walt Kelly, Animal Comics, Dell Publishing Company Incorporated, 149 Madison Avenue, New York, 16, New York. And it just says, "Dear Mr. Kelly, we cannot keep our joy to ourselves," etc. And now I have, as noted, I have copies of those letters. And if I ever want to see the actual copies, I can tootle all the way to Columbus and go look at them.
Have you?
It's an incredible resource.
Okay.
Everybody
Yeah.
needs to know about the
I
Billy Ireland comics.
I'm a library student, and the reason I became a library student was touring the village, was having Caitlin show me. I went there during the Bill Blackbeard exhibit. I
Sure.
got home and immediately ordered, like, spent about $115. I don't have $115. I was an undergrad, but on every well, I bought the Smithsonian book was cheap, but then I bought a bunch of other books. Like I have two, and eventually I figured out that the Smithsonian Book of Comics was easier to find than I thought it would be. The other book I bought was I had read this when I was younger, which was the Smithsonian Comic Book of Comics, which oh, I remember reading that when I was younger and I hated it because for one reason they cut the Superman story in half. Like which really bugged me.
Yes. And now, however, you can toss them up and let them hit you in the head because they're available.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the difference between then and now is huge.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
I
yeah,
mean,
when I was growing up, I just searched it up online to find the
uh,
rest of it.
I'm
Right.
more like you, Maggie. It's like I'm of I'm between the two generations here, as it kind of is. It's like anything that was about this subject was few and far between. So you glommed onto anything, even if it was inaccurate. You just said, "Well, it's still about comic books." I'm not saying
Exactly.
your book is. I just grabbed a book.
No,
It's like
no,
but
I have a bookcase. I have a bookcase in the other room that has all the, the early books. And by the way, a bound volume of the complete run of Zero. And again, we know Zero is spelled Xero by Dick and Pat Lupoff that did the All in Color for a Dime series.
Mhm.
And it was because it was one of their interests and it had the articles by various folks. I think one person said that they didn't want their article reprinted, but most of the rest have been reprinted since.
Very cool.
Now,
Silence falls across the.
but I must ask though, what is so how does one get like so I imagine that you was this would be like would this be the second obviously this is the reissue, but would it be the second book ever written about comic books? Because the first one would have been, I guess, Pfeiffer's book.
Right.
You
That
mean
was great
you
in
mean a
terms of
positive one?
anthology.
You mean a
Great,
Yeah,
yeah,
positive one?
the
Okay,
great
because
comic book heroes. I mean, just
yeah,
saying, there's
yeah.
all
yeah.
kinds of stuff. I actually have a copy of the book that was handed out at the New York, what the heck, it was New York legislature, how terrible comic books were.
Yeah.
And they actually printed all the disgraceful whatever stuff in there and how kids shouldn't be permitted to read comic books. And so that actually exists. It's a trade paperback. It's a huge trade paperback that apparently was just circulated among legislators so they could get their jollies by looking at hot images that the kids shouldn't look at. Just saying.
Because I was
But
saying,
crime comics were differentiated,
yeah.
and they actually passed a law in New York
Uh,
legislating quote crime comics. So, just saying,
'cause
tells
it's-
people how to do bad things. And by the way, yes, we did correspond with Frederick Wortham. Now that you ask,
that would be
All
my
right.
next question. You're right.
I'd love to know more about that now.
he didn't. He did a book called Fanzines, and he didn't understand fanzines any more than he understood comic books. Um, and one of the things, if you're looking for something, and I would hope that the Billy Ireland Museum has it, but I don't, or collection has it, but I don't know. There was a publication for Phi Beta Kappa scholars called, I think, American Scholar uh, magazine, but it was basically a trade paperback size magazine, and they had an article that I have seen that said all the ways that the supposed scientific method was not used by Wortham. So what he would do is say, do all these juvenile delinquents read comic books? Yes. Well, that must mean that comic books cause juvenile delinquency. Well, they also drank milk. So
Mhm.
obviously milk causes juvenile delinquency. So that but that was his scientific method, which was pointed out in this article in American Scholar.
Mm.
I got a glimpse of how comic book fans were treated in like the 50s when I was reading the book. They had a reissue of the book Mad for Decades, and I went to a Catholic high school because I'm from the city that no one goes to private school. I'm from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So no one goes to public school. So I'm reading this book, and then one of the older brothers of the Sacred Heart takes the book away from me, and he says, "You shouldn't be reading such trash." And he gives it to the disciplinarian. I get called in the disciplinarian's office, and the disciplinarian is 40 years younger than this guy. And he says, "I have no idea why this was taken from you. I'm really lost. Just, I guess, here's it back." And he looked through. He says, "I'm not really sure what's going on. I mean, you're not playing games on your computer. You're okay. Just don't read it in front of Brother Eldon, I guess."
Lovely,
He
lovely.
was so lost. He did not know why it was taken from me. Obviously, he went to Catholic High in like 2004, so he has no idea what's going on and why it was taken from me. He was just so confused.
Lovely. By the way, my brother, who worked at Marvel at one point, had a copy of Seduction of the Innocent, and he used it as his autograph book. So when there would be an event, he would take it around, and the autographs, as I bet you can imagine, are pretty great because then you get to pick which chapter are you going to sign your autograph on, which full page that's blank is going to have a fantastic piece of art by a comics creator, and it was very nice. Is very nice. I have it.
I was going to say, where did it end up? Yay.
My brother sadly died more than 2 years ago, and so I just mourn him every day because you talk about brains, um, and a cartoonist, and I mean, yes, he did fancy. He created micro comics, and those are designed to be usable on a like one sheet of paper makes a full comic book kind of situation. So he was very inventive. I invite you to one of his cartoons, which I will now describe. It is an eel, and it's coming toward the reader, and it has question marks over its head. And my brother loved gags about death, which is so appropriate after he died. But I've thought it would be kind of fun to have at a cemetery, but people wouldn't get it. Do you get it? It is an eel with question marks over its head. Do you know Latin?
No.
No.
So,
Okay, well,
no.
then it's
Except
gone.
for
Okay,
exit. Exit.
I believe the
You-
translation is something like "Remember, you must die." It is memento mori. So you have a
ah.
more trying to remember.
Got it.
I'm just saying.
Got
Yes.
it. Where are we going with all this? Um,
Topic number
yeah,
65.
I
Go
know.
for it.
I want to know. So, just so with Walt Kelly, you just corresponded back and forth. Were you doing the correspondence, or your parents,
My
or
parents. No, my
okay, they
parents.
you never did, or did you later
No.
on, or
Mm.
no?
Wrote him once or twice. At one point, one of the Pogo strips behind me here, I got from Selby Kelly.
Hmm.
And she had asked, so apparently at some point my name had come up, and she asked who I was, and he said some sort of cousin or some sort of relative. Well, his first response to my mom and dad was, he said, "Well, I could call you various things." He said, "I'll just call you Curtis Cousins." And he just called them cousins from that point on. Years later, his daughter Carolyn came to Comic Con. So I went over and I said, "Wow, mom and dad visited you." And I thought she was one day younger than me. And she said, "No, no, that's my older sister. I'm younger than that." So we ended up with a pajama party thing at Comic Con. And yeah, she was wonderful. She was a fine artist. She could describe sitting on Walt's lap while he drew, that kind of situation. It was just wonderful. And
Maggie, so
yep,
at last year's San Diego Comic Con, I was in the front row,
okay.
very front row, and y'all were discussing Kelly's Archives, and I actually had bought a comic book that you had just purchased, that you had just were describing, that you had like 10, you found like 12 copies. I had just bought it an hour before and actually held it up.
There we go. Yes, it's all about memories and treasuring and sharing and knowing the history. And that's what you guys are doing with this podcast is let's, before the, what is it, before the colors fade,
Right.
was the American Heritage had a series on that. And it was like, while people are still around, let's find out. Yeah. And
What
yeah,
what is the status of the next Pogo book? Because I've bought them all, and it's really bugging me that it keeps stretching.
well, I moved it so it would be out of the line of sight. But now, and I apologize to the people who are listening, but
You have it. No. And Camden can't get it.
It's like now it was July, it was June, it was October, then it was July. Now it's January of next year.
if we're lucky, this is what I have to work from.
Oh wow.
So I do the index. I am one of the delays. What actually happened was the wonderful commentator who did Swamp Talk, which is the history and putting things in
Hmm.
context, he died.
Mm.
So we are having to rebuild. And he also would say, how are you coming on, et cetera, et cetera. What I do, as noted, is I do the index, and I just started reworking on it yesterday. Among the challenges with the next volume is that it includes strips that are in Simon and Schuster collection called what is it? Prehistorical Pogo.
Mm.
Among the challenges is by the end of this volume, we haven't explained what the heck is going on. Where are they? What the heck is going on? Who are the? Why do we have a centaur, Lyndon Johnson, called the Lone Arranger? We have the first time since 1944 that there are human characters in Pogo. So what should we print in advance? We're having huge discussions as to what's going on. And in the meanwhile, I actually spent yesterday alphabetizing the exclamations for the index.
Mm.
Are you ready for that idea? So I'm just, yeah, and actually, okay, just
What
so to put that in
what
context.
what time frame are those strips? I'm not knowledgeable
Oh,
about which volume we're
it's
at.
it's
Third
1965,
volume.
1966.
Okay, got it. Okay.
So for example, uh, I suddenly realized I'm going, well, where did I get caught off guard and stop working on the frickin' index? And so I printed it out, teeny tiny type, and started to highlight the questions I had, and then realized that what I hadn't done is I started with the index of the previous year, and then it says see also. And one of the challenges is Walt doesn't necessarily call the same character the same name from
Wow.
month to month and whatever. And then, but in the exclamations, for example, we've got these are all exclamations now in alphabetical order with the
Jeez.
page number that they're on.
It's like
So, for example, and they're fun, like holy caustics, and how about hoo bliggy and hooly hooly woobly, and I'll be dog nabbed. Land of, love a poodle bird, land of mercy, land of mighty, lormy eyes, lormy love a duck, etc. But I've because people say, what book did he say thus and such in?
oh yeah.
Okay. So yes, but then it's also things like bird watching is on page 153 and 258. And it's there's a bear and there's a Russian bear is but it says barnacle bear see bear. Well, is there actually a barnacle bear reference in here? And my guess is not because it's from last index.
Mm.
So the challenges of indexing it are just one of the things. But I'm also taking notes such as the Lone Ranger. So again, I'm not sure if you're familiar. There's a centaur character in this strange other land of Pandemonia, and he's a centaur, but he's Lyndon Johnson. So what is that about? Well, R.C. Harvey was doing Swamp Talk. He would have annotated that.
Yeah.
I don't
Which
know, so I'm
for
looking it
somebody
up.
like me, it's really helpful.
Exactly. So we have to put that together. Well, I did find the explanation on that, which was that Lyndon Johnson had come up with a student loan program. So there's Lyndon Johnson as a centaur, but he said, you can call me the Lone Arranger. And he's wearing a cowboy hat and he's a centaur. So there we go.
I mean, I guess it's a good thing you lived through the era, so at least you can kind of remember obscure pop culture references that have kind of gone by the wayside.
I
It
wasn't
doesn't make
paying
it easier.
attention to what, no, no,
Okay.
no. Yeah, he's also dealing with the Vietnam War. He's also
Yeah.
in this, he's got a huge section on one of the characters is basically it's Kelly's attack on hippies,
Hmm.
which is very weird because hippies were fans and whatever. And he has a character who's like dropping out and hiding and whatever. And at the end of that particular little arc, he goes off to join the army. So he'd been a draft dodger, but now he's going to serve. So again, yeah,
Hmm.
there's a lot of essays to come, and we're challenged with, we also have lives. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
I wasn't
getting
complaining, I
it.
was just asking.
No, absolutely. No,
Uh,
it's
uh,
a totally legitimate. And that is
yeah.
going on. So if you go on Facebook, there's a group called I Go Pogo
Uh-huh.
and with an exclamation mark. And one of the questions that comes up all the time is where the heck is this volume? It's so delayed. Yes, it is. I think we are also having a challenge. I think there's still one strip that's missing.
Huh.
So people take for granted that, oh, you can just reprint. No, we have
Yeah.
to
Yeah,
dig
no.
up the strips.
Yeah.
Billy
Um,
Ireland helps.
I should know this. Camden probably knows this, but I'm not really collecting these volumes as voraciously as Camden is. Is the
I I my mother one time says you've got to stop buying from Fantagraphics. You have 8 books a week. You don't have the money.
Anyway, what is the ultimate plan with the Pogo books? Are they just going to the end of 73 when he passed away, or does it go through the Selby Kelly and even possible further incarnations that they did?
They would like to go through Sternecki and so forth. I don't know. Right
Mm,
now, as noted, we're just trying desperately to deal with stuff. As noted, I mean, he was
mm,
still doing things, and he did have assistants that were not. I'm not really in contact with, but there were people who worked on the strip in addition. So Sternecki and good, I've forgotten the other guy who did them, but basically it was with Selby's encouragement because
mhm.
it's a great strip, it's a great concept, and so forth. Yeah, I don't know. Right now, I would just like to get the freaking next one and the one after that, which actually explains what pandemonia is.
Mhm.
Which, as I say, people know if they have this pre-hysterical pogo, but they have no idea if they're just going to have the strips from these 2 years because it isn't explained till the next year.
Mm.
I have a question. So I know that I don't know if Fantagraphics does this as much as Dean Mullaney and Curtis, etc., do at Library Comics. But what about all the like extra stuff that's in the Pogo books, like the Simon and Schuster books, and like the and
Yeah,
there's occasionally extra strips, and then there's like all the other stuff Kelly did besides the strip. Like there's the comic books that Hermes Press did release, re-release, but they're so out of
Adventures
print
of
you generally
Peter
can't
Wheat.
get them.
Peter Wheat, Peter Wheat, Peter Wheat, and I actually contributed one of them to that.
Yeah,
Um, you talk about ones that are hard to find. Um,
I
and
have.
that, by the way, that when my parents visited Kelly for the first time, one of the kids in their bedroom had these comic books, and mom and dad said, "Well, what are those?" And he said, "Oh, that's Peter Wheat. That's an advertising thing I do." And he contacted the Bakers, what was it, Bakers Associates, and they sent Peter Wheat the booklets because they handed out free with Peter Wheat bread.
Mm.
And I actually have two bread wrappers from Peter Wheat bread that are framed on my wall, not this wall, um, but those are great. It's Walt Kelly doing swords and sorcery, and then he also did Christmas comics like Craig Yo reprinted, I think, Christmas with Mother Goose. He also did individual stories in Santa Claus Funnies, et cetera, et cetera, et
Right.
cetera. I haven't answered your question. Well, the challenge here is the Simon and Schuster books are different and they are not complete in the slightest. But yes, he did additional material that went in those collections, which they, as far as I know, not only does Fantagraphics not have the license for it, but
Oh,
um, Ogpie does, I assume, and Ogpie you'll see is the Okefenokee Glee and Purlieu Club is the owner thereof, and Mark Evanier is in charge of it and works with um, Peter, the surviving son from the first marriage, and I think there's maybe two others, but that didn't really grow up with in Walt's family. And they sort of get together and agree on what can be licensed and what can't. But Mark Evanier is basically magnificent and handling as much as can be handled.
He'll fix it.
yeah.
Uh,
Eh,
and
Okay.
everybody should go to everything Mark Evanier is in at Comic Con every year. I'm just saying.
I was at every one of them. Most of them. I didn't make the cartoon voices one because I was at the EC one. The
Oh, yeah.
EC, I was at the EC Comics one. I left the cartoon voices one early and I was at the EC one
Right.
because I wanted to see all the EC clips at
Sure.
the hotel next door.
Sure. Well, my grandson is works on voice artistry, and so we never miss the voice artists either because there's two different voice, as you know, two different voice artist
Yeah.
panels, completely different cast, and yeah, there's one Saturday, one Sunday, and they're wonderful. So,
Mhm.
and Fred Tatasciore is the most wonderful human being on the planet, just as a by the way, very,
I just wanted to
very
see.
kind. Very kind to my grandson. The first, okay, so here's an example of what goes on at conventions
You were
is
at the first one. I was going to ask you about that next. You were
no,
at the one in New
we were
York,
in
I mean.
we were the first multi-day comics convention. Yes. I thought there were only four females in attendance, but later it turned out Otto Binder's daughter was there as well. But it was
My job actually, my day-to-day job is I actually work in Michael Uslin's collection at the Lilly Library at Indiana University.
wow, yay.
And I'm reading, and I had lunch with him a while back because I'm the only student worker at the campus because usually they don't want students working with donors
Right.
because there's whole complications and all that. But they said you can have lunch with Michael Uslan, you can do whatever you need to do with Michael. So I had lunch with him when we mentioned you, and I was reading his biography, and one of the chapters was about the first comic book convention, and he mentions the four females that were at the convention, and he mentions you as one of them. He
Yeah.
says, because he wrote it like there were, contrary to what you mean, I think there were women there. There was Maggie Thompson and I think three other people.
Yeah.
Did you know the three other women?
Sure. Well,
Oh,
it was
who are there?
Pat Lupoff, as
Oh,
in
okay.
Zero, Dick and
Mhm.
Pat,
Okay.
and Lee Hoffman. I think I got that right. No, shoot. Um, maybe not. And Marvel's receptionist. She was
Flo?
the
Was it
face of
Flo?
Marvel to the fans. Who?
Flo Steinberg?
Flo
Yeah.
Steinberg. Yes,
Okay.
but is it Lee Hoffman? Lee, doggone. Anyway.
No problem.
Yeah.
If you don't
Yeah, I'm
remember.
sorry.
Uh,
See, I thought I was doing homework here.
yeah.
Instead, I've had all my notes. I could check. Let's just talk among yourselves for a minute while I check all my references, because I actually did bring references. It's disappeared. I was bringing various credential aspects. What a
Well,
bloody.
we can go back to Camden's question is like just
Sure.
what happened at that convention or what you were
It's
at
great.
that first one and what did
Yeah.
what do you think it
Well,
led to, I guess, is
All,
right? Yeah.
the most of the attendees were teen boys. So most of them were like about my shoulder height, and they were all talking about buying and trading and whatever. Ted White was there. Don debated the comics code with Leonard Darvin, who was in charge of the comics code. And Don's point was basically if they were big companies, they were able to get away with more than the small companies were able, so that it was corrupt,
Yeah.
basically.
Was this
And
before? Sorry to interrupt, but is this before? Was it what year was this convention? Was it before Comics Code was kind of loosened up in the early 70s or?
uh,
Oh yeah.
yes,
Okay. Okay.
67, I think, was what the bookie said in the book.
the hell did I put all my, I did this specifically so I would have information.
Let's see.
Now we're opening a can of worms. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's in the boil of Batman. Okay.
Okay, we'll have to do this again sometime. Well, I'll find all my notes about my life. But yes,
I was
Okay.
also gonna
the
ask as
John Benson ran that convention. So he was a science fiction fan in New York,
Mhm.
and it was mostly science fiction fan than the high school kids. And basically, the concept, what was happening was Leonard Darwin said, "Oh no, everything's up and up and whatever." And Ted White, who was a science fiction fan, editor, writer, etc., stood up and said, "Sir is a pile of crap." Uh, Apology, I have to bleep that. And yeah, because it
Mm.
wasn't well done. But yeah, it was definitely at the
yeah,
heyday of the
he
code.
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
somehow Michael half the chapter about him going to the convention is him having to convince his dad to convince his to convince his him having to convince his dad to convince his mother to let him go inside because and finally they let him in because he was just sitting at a bar with Otto Bender. And for half the convention, Otto Bender was just showing him around, and he met Bill Finger there, and he,
Oh,
which I
it
think
was the
Michael's
movers
greatest
and
regret is that
shakers.
he spent about 50 hours with Otto Bender doing
Sure.
that audio tape, and he says my biggest regret is not having an audio tape for any of this.
Mhm.
Yeah. No, Bender was, I mean, again, Bender came out of the world of science fiction. So as we came out of the world of science fiction, and when we started comic art, again, we were just following in the tradition of if you like something, you do a magazine about it, mimeograph. And how many people have I had say, "Oh, I love the smell of mimeograph ink," and I go, "That is not mimeograph. That is spirit duplicating ditto." And the advantage to comics fans doing ditto was that you could have all different colors. If you were going to do different colors in mimeograph, you had to fill the ink drum with a different color and run the page through again,
Oh, wow.
which was obvious. Yeah, just saying. We actually we ran an article about Scarlet. Um, what the heck? We called it a study in Scarlet, and it was a superhero Scarlet something or other. And I actually took red ink, literally pen ink, and just splashed it on the page because
Yeah.
that got color. Just
Yeah,
saying.
I never did that format. The earliest I did as a kid in school was the Ditto thing, and you had
Yep.
the drum and you just
Yep.
and shot
But
out
your
the
print
purple
runs were
sheets.
small. Your print runs were small.
Yeah.
So the mimeograph could do like 1,000 copies,
Mm.
and Ditto could do like 100.
Yeah, that's what I remember. Then things
Yeah, as
improved.
someone who grew up with like, I think the first time I ever saw an older fanzine, I was like, wait, something's not right here. Because I grew up with the internet and was like, wait, what's going on? I'm like, oh wait, yes, this makes sense now. Because it took me a few minutes to read this. I think it was a different issue of Animania, not the one you gave me, Mark, obviously, but like an older issue.
Yeah.
I was like, what's going on?
Well, the earliest issue, it was Mind Rot originally. The earliest issue I have of that was just typed on 8.5 by 11
Yeah,
paper and stapled in the corner. That was how
that's what I mean.
my own Harveyville Fun Times, the first three issues are typed on a typewriter. It just seems like it's 100 years ago. Well, it almost is, but it's like, I thought, weren't we using computers in the 90s? But, I guess initially I didn't have a computer, and, eventually I did, and the rest is history. But, you know, I would say now, it's like, if I got into fandom now, I'd probably just do exactly what we're doing, which is a podcast. I probably wouldn't have dealt with fanzines and, trying to, you know, deal with the publishing end of things because,
And now there's really only two fanzines left. There's Alter Ego and then there's Hogan's Alley.
Right. Well, there's I think there's actually more technically, and again, some may have small circulation or just be printing them in a whatever group. I've been taking this around from convention to convention, trying to persuade some publisher to do a biography of Walt Kelly. At the same time, being aware nobody cares about Walt Kelly now because they
I
haven't
do.
read Walt Kelly. So what you do, my thesis here is you have each chapter as a comic book story, and you have it scripted by a different celebrity and drawn by a different celebrity, and you add photographs,
Hmm.
and then you've got a market because they will say how important it is. So, for example, I've got, I mean, nobody recognizes or realizes the stuff that
Yes. Oh yeah.
Kelly Kelly did a strip for the Bridgeport paper in the 19 and then he worked for the Bridgeport paper and he got assignments from a publisher with the New York City editorial office. So we've got Back to Nature with Cannonball Jones, and I found original art in Kelly's papers at Mark Evaner's place, and I went, wait a minute, I recognize that character. It's Cannonball Jones from the 1930s. Um, but it never was printed because it only appeared in Comics Magazine number whatever the heck. So it requires obsessives and it requires biographies and but I've got, history because of I've seen the papers. For example, he did art for his senior high school yearbook. And so that's a scan thereof. And there's his, whatever this is, certifies that Mr. Walter Kelly won 34 points in the Sunday Post July 1927 contest. And then he won high honors. So, I mean, his papers survive. Is
What
it a
is your thoughts on the
bit?
two other existing Kelly biographies?
Right. Right.
One by Thomas and not Andre that Hermes did, and then the
Right.
other one by Carrie Soper, which
Right. They're not going to collect them, they don't, etc. But his papers survive, and believe me, they are entertaining.
Mm.
So, I mean, you have a guy who's a master of words and pictures, and yeah. So, and by the way, here's another footnote about him. If you look at the beginnings of Pogo, obviously it was in Animal Comics from Dell. They were all just funny animals, and it was a
yeah.
funny animal strip. And then the New York Star started in 1948, and it was a liberal newspaper in New York City, and he was the art director of that. So he not only did Pogo for the Star, funny animal strip, he also did political cartoons. He also, by the way, did weather cartoons. So if it was raining, there would be this little thing on the front page that would have somebody with an under an umbrella. And I was able, by the way, to buy some of that original art from heritage auctions because they didn't realize what it was.
Uh,
Yeah, so at some point I need to have those framed. But in any case, then the Star folded and he managed to take it to a syndicate. But when he took it to the syndicate, it was as a funny animal strip
mm,
and he couldn't do political cartoons anymore. So then as you start to watch, as the strip evolves, he starts putting his political commentary in the strip.
okay.
Because prior to that, it was just funny animals, gags.
Right.
I had an intense debate with somebody the other day that I guess online he was convinced that Pogo wasn't political. He was in the conservative side because I think he was in denial. I
Wow.
think he was in denial because he was on the conservative side. I would, I would call him wacko. Uh, and I'm arguing with him like, my dude, the, my dude, the McCarthy
J
is
Malarkey,
on
Simple
the
J
cover.
Malarkey. Yeah.
Yeah. What more do you need for proof?
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah.
Uh,
Goodness. So, yeah. But again, we come back to Harvey P. Carr. There's no limit to how good the words can be, and no limit to how good the pictures can be. And now we've got some other formats too. So what do we do? And do we keep the originals? And is there an original, or is it all going to be AI, and we're just going to take this image from this
Hmm.
image from? I don't know.
Interesting. Yeah.
Is the my I one of the I'm wondering though is how like I have a couple of Hermes Press's Pogo Dell comic archives. I actually bought them from my local comic shop. They had been sitting in the store for years, and I'm like, "You're not going to sell these unless I buy them. Can I have them for cheaper than you're selling them for?" He's like, "Sure." So he sold them. They were like $30 each. And he says, "I can give you both for $10." I'm like, "Okay."
I'm gonna use that. You're not gonna
I'm
sell
like,
these to
"Hey, I've
anybody
lived here
else.
for 2 years. You see me here every week. You know they're not going to go anywhere."
Yeah. No, those were wonderful comics. And he did adapt them. And as noted, in 1944, he's dropped the last human character. I think partly because there was a problem with the coloring. He couldn't coordinate the human characters with the animals and just like get rid of the human character and let's just move on. And so yeah, and there was a collection back in the day, which I bought off the newsstand called Pogo Parade, which was a collection of the early Pogo, some of the early Pogo stories, and with an introduction and explaining what was going on. It's one of the few reprints from Dell. I mean, they reprinted their own material, so there was that.
Right.
One of the things I've been looking for is that I've been writing for Jerry about the Warner Brothers comic books. I wrote an article about Ralph Heimdall, which I work with. There's an archive in North Carolina that has all of his papers, and I guess I was the only person to ever write about that.
Oh
So
yeah,
yeah, it has all of his papers and everything. They really don't know what they can do with it because obviously, as someone who works in the library, the library archivist, the copyright archivist at our campus is probably the most important employee here. But one of the things I've been learning is that there is a Bugs Bunny comic book that Kelly wrote, and it's like I think it's in Camp Comics, and I've been trying to find a copy somewhere. I
yeah,
can't find a copy because every online copy cuts the Bugs Bunny part out of it.
heck. Yeah, it's Seaman Wheeler and something else is in Camp. I think there were three issues, right?
Yeah,
And I have them. But yeah, um, I, I'm not sure they killed. And excuse me,
No,
I actually will look that up.
nobody,
So
nobody's even
anyone
thrown them on Internet Archive, even temporarily. That usually is where you find stuff, and then
they're
it
on
goes
Comic
away.
Book Plus and Digital Comic Museum,
Yeah.
but they cut the Bugs Bunny part out, I
Well,
think.
yeah. So I'm saying on Internet Archive, just grab it before it gets taken down. You
I,
know, you know.
I would guess that can't. What a good question in terms of the copyright, because he did. Walt did stuff for the government, and that's public domain because it's the government.
Right.
Um, but Camp Comics was done by Dell. But I just wonder on the copyright on those. Now that's what a good question. I will go peek at my copies and see what they say. Mine are not cut. Um, but yeah, what the hey, interesting.
Hmm.
Uh,
But I know that he also did the other thing that was in the Looney Tunes Mary Melodies comics was the Penguin Pete and
oh,
and sorry Sally and they which were reprints of popular comics that they just put in the back of them.
okay.
Hmm.
The
Oh,
not Penguin Pete,
Patsy
the
and Patsy and Pete.
yeah,
Patsy and Pete, and they ran in the Bugs Bunny. You're right. Yep, 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 yep.
yeah.
Yeah. Actually, there's one other thing that he did, which I am now going to get to wave at you. So talk among yourselves for a minute. Apologies to the people who can't see.
Bye bye, Maggie. Um,
Yeah.
you want to switch
Mark,
the
how often, yeah, Mark, apologies to people who can't see. How often am I here just holding up random stuff and not apologizing?
every time you're on the show. That's okay.
I have
Um,
a pile of stuff every time I'm here just sitting
yeah.
next to me.
I guess we can go back to comic fandom after we do the Pogo stuff or Walt Kelly stuff. But anyway, go ahead.
This is Mark Kelly. And one of the aspects of life is that, so you may recall I told the anecdote about mom reading the stories and
Yeah.
dad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I was going to kindergarten, so this was at uh, my my dad's dad was a Cornell professor. My dad was doing grad studies at Cornell, and I was going to kindergarten
Mhm.
and in Ithaca. And I assume it was one of those parent get-togethers or whatever. And my parents were recommending Kelly to people, and the one guy that they talked to was named Milt Cowan, and he said, "Oh yeah, I worked with Kelly." And they go, "What?" And he says, "Oh yes, and I have a." I mean, he had a Kelly connection. And what he had been was he was head of the modern languages department at Cornell. And during World War II, they did booklets. This particular one that I'm waving is the TM30-341 Japanese introductory series language guide. And what it is it's in phonetics. So if you're in Japan, here's how you can speak to people, but they wanted to make it entertaining for the service people. And so Kelly did cartoons that would illustrate using things in casual conversation. There aren't a lot of pictures, but that's how Milt Cowan ended up working with Walt Kelly and telling how things are pronounced, Japanese language guide how to use it, and then explaining that syllables were shown in thus and such a way in terms of this. Well, this is what Milt Cowan did.
Mm,
And as noted, he had a Kelly collection, some of which I ended up with. So
very cool.
yep. I'm celebrity adjacent award-winning pop culture nerd is my
Yes,
I
celebrity
always,
adjacent is a good description for me too.
I always
Yes.
found, I always say the celebrity introductions, I found the
Excuse me.
ones Pogo a lot better than the ones in Peanuts because the Pogo ones at least come from people who are interested, and I feel like the Peanuts ones were like they were just there.
Oh, you mean the complete Peanuts with those
Yeah,
introductions? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
so Schultz was so wonderful.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
again, if you were a fan back in the day, um, write to him and say, I would like the original of thus and such. And he would just say, sure, and have the syndicate send it. But first come, first served.
Yeah.
So we would say, and he said, well, you can have it if it's still out there. And then he'd say, oh, no, sorry, the syndicate says somebody else got it first.
Mm,
So just as a footnote to that, there was one that I got. Um, it typified my relationship with Don, and I managed to get it. I think I gave it to Don for Valentine's Day or something. Let's see if I can tip my screen enough for you to see it. It's the one,
Ah,
but it's the one between the Inkpot Awards
oh,
at
way up there.
Krause.
Okay. Hmm.
And I will now turn around to read it. And it says something like that up there is the sky. The sky is blue. This is grass. The grass is green. And the last panel is she's leaning up against us. Isn't he wonderful? He knows everything. And that was my relationship with Don. And so I got that, and that was fine. And apparently nobody else asked for that. I mean, I got there under the wire, but Don worked at the Cleveland Press, which was carrying Peanuts. And so he got to see them first.
Mm.
And we set it up because you couldn't cheat, but we sent an airmail special delivery request to the syndicate for the Snoopy cartoon, in which you may recall as Snoopy is working on the story, and he says, "That stupid Thompson, he's done it again," is the last line. We sent an airmail special delivery request. Thompson is in trouble. That stupid Thompson, he's done it again. So yes, my son now has that at his
Okay.
house.
Now
Because it's hard to have it.
Thompson isn't you Thompson, right? You or Don, right? It's just a
Just
name Thompson.
Thompson is in trouble.
Right.
Thompson is in
Because
trouble.
there is a book, a paperback collection called that came out in the early
Yes.
70s. Yeah, that has that strip probably in it, I'm sure.
Yes, it
Yeah.
does.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. And my son has the original.
Ah, got it. Okay. But it
There,
was just a random name or somebody that Schultz knew elsewhere.
I
So, okay.
I was telling. I was telling somebody the other day is that the book that was my epiphany for comic strips was Brian Walker's book on the complete comics, the combined version, which I interviewed him at one point. I'm like, my parents had to go through three different copies because I destroyed two of them reading it over and over again for like hours straight, like in like a toy room, just like sitting there. I was so little. I was in second grade. I had to weigh it. I was interested. I'd never seen a book that big.
Oh, that's
I was
fun.
so little. I weighed it on my parents' bathroom scale. First thing I did, because I'd never seen a book this big. Now my parents, I always thought I just bought it at Barnes and Noble. My Brian Walker says you bought the Borders version, and I had to remember what Borders was.
Yeah.
But and now one of the things that I remember about it was I asked him. I said like, how is it so? And he told me he says, you know the reason why collecting comics art is so hard now? And I'm like, why? He says, because the Schultz Museum is buying all of them, which I thought was very funny.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. And the other thing is that the rumor has, well, it actually was that they used to throw out comic strips
Oh
back in the
yeah.
day. They did at King Features. I think the story was that they used them, when it was wet or whatever, they just put it in so
I
people would,
mean,
yeah, leak all.
you hear the stories though about when when he says, I'm not, because I did this whole article about comic book librarianship history, like the history of comics and libraries and museums, and I got so big that my professor says, please stop. So we never even finished it because I got a tour of the Billy Ireland. I interviewed about 40 people, all at Michigan State, at in the
Randy
Cartoon Art
Scott.
Museum in London, in Spain. Obviously, the Billy Ireland. I interviewed every person from Lucy Caswell onward to the Billy Ireland,
Yeah.
and then I interviewed a bunch of other people. And I'm like, the stories about the opening of the museum in Connecticut kind of disturbing. They used like duct tape comic arts to the walls, and I'm like, and he's
Yeah.
like, yeah, we didn't know any better at the time. We figured that out. He says I had to stop that pretty quickly.
Wow.
Well, I think it was the first, wasn't it?
The
Yeah,
Connecticut one? Yeah.
The Museum of Cartoon Art. Yeah. The
yeah.
Walker. Yeah. Yeah.
The one in Britain was a little older. There's one in Britain that was a little older,
Oh,
but
okay. Okay.
I think Aura came out at the same time, but it was like, yeah.
And then there
Brian
was
was also the one who,
Bill Blackbeard in his house. Come on.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, Bill Blackbeard's house. I'm completely fascinated with Bill Blackbeard though, and I'm like,
Wonderful.
I would, yeah, because I was at the exhibit for him. That's when I came. I'm like, I have to go to this one, right? I
Right.
convinced my parents to drive me there. I convinced the school to not give me credit off, so I convinced them to say this is the school trip. I'm like, well, this is really I'm an IDM in film history. I could write about whatever I wanted to because my professor was Michelle Foreman. But but they're like, all right. So I went there. I'm there. Caitlin shows me behind the scenes, and I'm like, and I'm just completely fascinated by Bill Blackbeard's exhibit. And it's just, it was insane.
Yeah.
How does he live?
Wasn't it Barbara Tiger? Wasn't that his partner? I think. But yeah, it was six semi loads
Yeah,
from that
it was
house.
seven semi loads.
Seven semi loads. Okay. Yeah. No, he was wonderful. And I mean, yeah, he was a comics fan who was a comics fan and saved collections.
Yeah,
Going from library to library as the libraries go, oh, microfilm will be fine. What could possibly go wrong with microfilm? That's
as a
so much.
library student, and now in
Yeah.
archives, our archive, I'm in our manuscript classes. Let's just say microfilm is not a friend. It's not our friend.
No.
I've looked at microfilm and I'm like, what is this?
Right. No, it's horrible. I actually have, so at a garage sale years ago here, I walk up and it's got this huge screen and I said, "Well, what is that?" And they said, "Oh, you could use it to view your slides on." Now, it's a screen this side. You're going to put your little slide on the screen? No. What it was, yes, microfilm, microfiche viewer. And so, yeah, you could use it to roll through, but I actually have comics on microfiche, and that does work. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I
I
have. whatever ones they saved, Comic Color, I think something like that. Anyway, saved a bunch of comics, Golden
Yeah,
Age comics.
yeah, like all the comic books, pretty much every comic book. Like, how did you find access to some of the comic book online? Because like the same microfilm issues of comic books have been circulated from collectors to collectors online for years. The fact that nobody can read about a third of them, nobody can even read.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No. And one of the things that I suddenly realized, I was talking to Karen Green and realizing that apparently now Fantagraphics, we can probably go if we're missing a strip, we might be able to get it legitimately downloaded online. So that may solve a major problem in terms of books to come. Because one of the challenges that we have with Pogo is the full strip. You know about the Sunday strips, right? In newspapers,
Yeah.
there's three
Hmm.
formats.
Hmm.
There's
Hmm.
tabloid format, there's two strips and three strips, and the only one that's complete is three strips.
Hmm.
Yeah.
But the comics had to, the Sunday comic had to be done so proportionally. Throw away this panel or throw away these panels and still have a strip. And we're now down to the era of where mostly it's the two strips that survive rather than the three strip version, which means you're going to lose the top
I,
tier of the
I
three strip.
think the first moment I realized the quality of comic strips was Curtis Finley's book on Chuck Jones's comic strip, which I have three different copies of because two different members of the Jones family, Chuck Jones family, gave me copies of them, copies of
Oh,
it.
wow. Chuck 'em up.
But yeah, yeah. So it was and I realized I'm like, and Curtis told me, he says, yeah, because the strips that we didn't have even access to, we had to use offline, and offline copies don't work, but that's all you got with the comics that
Yeah.
circulated so poorly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Oh, we clipped strips. That's another thing. So at and I've been talking to Karen Green about that because I've got an attic full of clipped strips, and she said indexing them. And so again, you get the library challenge.
Yeah,
She said,
scrapbooks.
"What you mean individual strips?" And Billy Ireland has individual strips, but they don't really want, she said, and I may be completely misquoting her, but they don't want individual strips. Well, I've got them saran wrapped by year. Why wouldn't you want them?
Yeah.
Uh, so it's all the ones that we clipped back in the day.
We at the Lilly Library, we just got this giant scrapbook collection of like there was some guy, Michael O'Connell, which donated these Milton Caniff
Mm,
bound, but what's interesting was there were bound volumes like about this big. It was just some guy clipping anything about Milton Caniff just in a scrapbook. And I'm
Hmm.
like, because we just had to do our own exhibit in our manuscripts class. I did the exhibit of they own the collection of, our library owns the collection of Colton Waugh,
okay.
of a little bit of Colton Waugh stuff, but all of it was like the stretch between all of the art is clearly somebody, he sent this to somebody, and clearly it didn't come from Colton Waugh. It was like come from some manuscript dealer who sold it to the Lilly, and it was the period between when he started the Dickie Dare strip and the process going into it. So it's all the correspondence between Kniff and himself going back and forth,
Hmm.
right? About you got to draw it this way. Kniff saying, "Hey, pal, I would draw the boat this way," and it's all boats, and obviously Colton Waugh's history with boats. And my exhibit, somebody next to me was presenting early books from the first ever book published in Spain, and the Lily obviously owns like the very first thing you walk in the room is John Ford's Oscars for the Grapes of Wrath and the Gutenberg Bible. Those are the first two things that pop up when you go in the building. And I just said, I'm going to talk about Colton Waugh. That was what I was presenting. Some people were presenting stuff like original Shakespeare. Someone presented the manuscript for Barry's Peter Pan. And it was like, I'm going to present this Colton Waugh art because that's what I want to do.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
For
Oh,
us comic fans, yes. Um, I'm going to shift gears for a second here because, we're not going to be on forever. Maybe we will. Um,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. The other thing we kind of wanted to talk about, and I kind of know this, but I'd rather hear it in your words. How did you get involved with the Comic Buyer's Guide in the first place? I mean,
Oh,
what's the chronology of everything that led to
well,
that?
well, Alan Light started, he called it the Buyer's Guide. No, he called it um, the Buyer's Guide for Comic Fandom.
Fandom, yeah.
And he did, I think he had invited us to write for it, and we kind of did the nah, that's okay. And then oh well
I thought
actually
you
we
were
were
in the early issues,
no,
but
no,
maybe
no,
I'm,
we were, but we
yeah, yeah.
initially we said well, because we were doing, oh, what the heck, was it Newfangles? And again, I've lost my freaking uh, wait a minute. Oh,
Hey, all right, we'll go back
there
and
it
do the
is.
Pogo. Take two.
All right. Now I finally found my reference that I was going to have available for this entire thing. So, yeah, we did. And by the way, we also did in 1968, we did a listing of the Dell special numbers because that didn't exist.
Didn't you do
Yeah,
the four colors? Is that what that is? That list
yeah,
as well?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
The
All
listing
right.
of Dell Special Series comic books and a few others
Hmm.
because we just wanted the information.
Right.
Okay, so yeah, here we go. Newfangled. So 1971, December, we were okay. Newfangles was Newfanangles, right? So Newfangles was a newsletter, maybe 3 pages, 4 pages, 6 pages, whatever, of news that came out. And we were collating an issue at 2 o'clock in the morning. And what we would do is we would print it and then collate it and then uh, stick address labels on it. And Don had a roll of stamps. So we were doing the thing staple and then the roll of stamps, and he would do this, right, as we're getting it ready to mail it. And suddenly we are sitting across a card table from each other, and he screamed in my face. I mean, we're this close, right? He's going, "Whoa." And I go, what? What? And what had happened was one of our cats was attracted by the roll of the stamps and had
Oh no.
done that into his thigh.
Oh,
And it was midsummer, and we said, this is, we can't do this anymore. This is terrible. But there were other fanzines, and they were done by kids, and kids didn't realize the responsibilities. So if you take subscription money, you need to fulfill the subscription. You can't just walk off with sticky quarters. So we announced that we were going to end it in with number 54 in December of that year, and we did a countdown. But we announced that we were quitting. Well, Alan Light said, "Oh gosh, I really love Newfangles. How about if I took care of all that business that you don't want to do, and I'll just, he had money that he'd saved from a summer job, I think, and he said, I'll just take that over, and then you just provide the material, and I'll take care of printing and whatever." And we said, basically, get lost, kid. We said we're done. So he started Buyer's Guide. And so 1971, December, Newfangles 54. And finally, in Buyer's Guide number 19, dated August 15th, 1972, was our half-page column, which was called Beautiful Balloons. And what it featured was us in a hot air balloon with a little speech balloon tag on it. And then Superman's arm, not specified that it was Superman, but clearly, so we said up, up, and away. And then he goes, "That's my beautiful balloon." And that was the start of our column. And so we started writing the column. When Alan sold it to Chet Krause in Wisconsin, Chet asked for recommendations as to who could edit it, who would have, he wanted to turn it into a newspaper. So it was basically camera ready ads. And he wanted to turn it into an actual typeset newspaper. And who could Alan recommend? And Alan recommended us because I had created Fantasy Empire. So I had that credential of having created that magazine. And Don had worked for the Cleveland Press for 23 years. So he was a journalist. So we were a team. And Chet, how are you going to work together? I don't understand that. We said, well, we've been doing it a long time. And he said, okay. And he hired us. So, yeah, at that point, the most stressful holiday season we ever had was we had the Christmas tree, and and our kids, and they opened all their presents, and then we packed everything back together and moved. So December 27th, we moved to central Wisconsin. And
Uh, I have a question. Like when I've collected, I've bought. Obviously, I'm always buying used comic art magazines, and a lot of magazines seem to come and went within one issue. Like, why is that?
It's
It's a lot
They
of
tough.
like,
work.
Yeah, I was going to say
Yeah.
it's tough doing it. I did 75
yeah.
issues over a 21-year period, but
Uh,
for the first 16 years I was quarterly, but then it's just like it's just like doing this podcast. I announced a couple months ago I'm not doing them as frequently because I was doing like between 45 and 50 a year, and it's just a lot, so, I'd rather do an occasional one and still keep
Right,
doing it, but
right.
and yeah, but it's
Well,
a lot of work. Yeah,
well, the advantage that we had in working at Krause is he did collector publications.
mhm.
So he had started Numismatic News, which is the longest running, basically ad-driven uh, publication for coin collectors. So he started that in October 1952 in this tiny town. And eventually, he also collected cars. So he did a publication called Old Cars Weekly. He discovered that there was an interest in trading cards, so he did Sports Collectors Digest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then he was looking to buy collector publications, and he bought the two that Alan did. One was called The Buyer's Guide for Comic Fandom, and the other was called Film Collector's World. So we were hired to edit both of those. Film Collector's World, all the subscribers hated each other uh, because if you collected film, you didn't collect videotape. And if you collected 8 millimeter silent film, you didn't collect 8 millimeter sound film. And anthropomorphic, blah, blah, not anthropomorphic, anyway, what is it, the widescreen, whatever
Oh.
that,
CinemaScope.
yeah, that.
Mhm.
But those collectors didn't want to do 16 millimeter and so forth and so on. Now, by the way, Alan remains a wonderful human being.
Mhm.
So, for example, he paid for us when we were doing the column for Film Collectors World. He paid for us to come to the Abogance Napoleon at the Chicago Theater, and you don't even know what the hell I'm talking about,
Not sure. I'm not even sure.
right? Ever heard of Abogance? Ever heard of Napoleon? It was a film that pioneered widescreen. It was a silent movie.
Oh, okay.
And the way you got widescreen was you had three projectors side by side, and at various points, wham, they all did. And suddenly it went from
So,
35 millimeter to 35 millimeter plus 35 millimeter plus 35 millimeter, and it was that
so it's
wide.
like Cinerama,
It was wider.
wider than
Um,
Cinerama. Wow.
Think about it.
Okay.
35 millimeter, 35 millimeter, 35 millimeter.
Oh
And then he
yeah.
experimented. It was pioneering. So, for example, spoiler, the ending, it's about Napoleon march. It ends with Napoleon marching into Italy. And so you have the three, and you have him speaking to the troops, and there's visions of Josephine on one side, and you have the map of Europe on the other side, and then you have the whole army walking toward you on all three screens, and it's the colors of the French flag
Hmm.
are super. I mean, it was an incredible movie, and Alan paid for us to go to it so we could see it. And that, oh, and with the full orchestra, there was a new soundtrack, quote, soundtrack, which is to say a live orchestra conducted by Carmine Coppola.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And by the way, if you have a 4.5 hour movie, which this was, uh, full orchestra can't play for 4.5 nonstop hours. So it alternated with a theater organ.
Oh, wow.
Just remembering, just
Never thought
saying,
about that. I
I
worked for
just saying,
I worked for his son at one point.
there you go. Well, and you
I'll
can't
just
get
throw that
that
out there.
version. You can't get that version because it's copyright by
Huh.
Coppola.
Huh.
See, so it's a public domain movie. It's a
Yeah.
silent
Yeah.
movie. But because of the soundtrack, you'll never see that, etc. Blah
Hmm.
blah.
Interesting.
Actually, it is on Laserdisc, I think.
Yeah, I
Which
was
I have.
well, if I still worked for Francis, you were allowed to check out any film in his archive, which was any of his previous films and everything, except for his porno film, which he disowned and didn't act like it
Ah,
existed. But you could get Dementia 13 in a very nice print, which is not the best film, but at least good
Well,
print, you know.
again,
Anyway, that was when I was working there. That was in about 1994. So
I,
the big hit at the time was Dracula, and he was working on Don Juan and a few other things, you know. So there we go.
I will toss in the fact that my favorite article that we ever ran for any, I mean, Comics Buyer's Guide, or as we retitled it, Movie Collector's World, um, was an Over the Transom submission because so we were in science fiction land. So our friend Lawrence Watt Evans was a science fiction writer, and he did an article, a front page article for us on the first issue we did, which was "You Think Plan 9 from the worst movie ever made." He said this is not true. The worst movie ever made was Creature of Destruction,
Hmm,
which was a Larry Buchanan remake of, I think, The She Creature.
hmm,
And it starred the bland Aaron Kincaid as the character, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
hmm.
Over the transom, we got a manuscript from Aaron Kincaid, who said Lawrence Watt Evans is absolutely correct. The Creature of Destruction is the worst movie ever made. He
Hmm.
said, but I wasn't bland. My performance was blind, as in blind drunk, 7 sheets to the wind on Grand Marnier, because the only way I could get through that horrible, horrible movie.
Wow. Interesting. Now I'll have to
Wonderful.
check that one out. I see a lot of obscure, weird stuff, but you know, I don't think I've even
Mhm.
heard of
Creature of
that one. So,
Destruction. Creature of
okay,
Destruction. There's a
okay,
reason.
okay. And I even have Plan 9 in my collection. It is not that
So
bad.
do
I mean,
I.
it's just like it's like a cheap sitcom or something.
What
Anyway,
is it Hyacinth Bucket says in the British sitcom? It's like, we are anonymous in this.
yeah.
Yes, there we are.
I'm kind of just throwing out random questions. So, you
Question.
know, so we did all in color. You did all in color for the dime, and then the comic book. Why did you stop there? Was there a reason, or was the second book not as popular, or you got too busy with Comic Buyer's
No,
Guide? What was?
it was just let's do a new edition of these existing books. I mean,
But I
it's just a
mean,
comment.
a third book, you know, in the series or anything else?
Fine.
Or well, I don't know. It's just
We did articles.
comic,
We had full articles on various characters. I mean,
right?
our job was to do a frickin' weekly newspaper. You think that's
Yeah,
not
well, that's what I was saying.
complicated?
That's why I asked. Is that getting in the way? It obviously did. So yes, you
True.
know,
This is true. And we eventually had to insert a price guide. We actually, I mean, the job kept expanding, and we got wonderful staff members. So I'm
yeah.
still friends with a lot of our staff. I mean, Brent Frankenhoff works for me
Hmm.
once a week, comes over and tries to organize my stuff. I lots of luck. Thanks, Brent.
Yeah.
But John Jackson Miller, who was one of the assistant, whatever, he was an associate editor. He took over editing, creating basically a comics retailer magazine, which created Free Comic Book Day.
Hmm.
And he is now, I don't know if you've seen Comicron, but if you have not seen Comicron, I invite you. It is an incredible resource. He loves statistics. So
Hmm.
he maintained statistics on comic circulation over the decades. He's
Oh,
got more
yeah, I've seen that.
information.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's John. He lives, he also lives in this county. And by the way, he's a New York Times best-selling author of Star Wars, Star Trek, and
Hmm.
Batman
Hmm.
books
Yeah.
right
I
now.
didn't think of his name at first, but when you said all that, I go, yeah, okay, I know.
It's John.
Okay, okay.
I have a quick question.
Mhm.
So, at what point did it become hard? Like if I was to pitch an article about like like I've pitched articles about when I wrote my thing on Ralph Heimdall, Jerry Beck was the only one to publish it. At what point did it become hard to write anything that is not either a superhero or a manga in the comics world? At what point did it just become impossible?
I don't know. Buyer's Guide would have done any of those.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's not my field of expertise. Manga are wonderful and are actually, I think, became big because they did what comic books used to be
Right.
prior to the obsession on superheroes. It was like, here's comics about lots of
yeah.
stuff, funny animals, people, whatever, bridge clubs, mahjong playing, whatever. It's not my expertise, but I am aware of it and do buy what I can. also, but I'm out of the loop.
Yeah.
But anybody can do a fanzine right now. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean
Yeah,
you'll make money on it.
Yeah.
right.
I think in the more less fanzine-ish, more arguably professional, I think the shift kind of happened, and you probably witnessed it because you were still doing Comic Buyer's Guide when Wizard came along. That kind of shifted the tone of everything superhero, but also, there's the market crash too in the early 90s. That did a big shift. And I think even putting things in the direct market kind of screwed things up. Even though everybody praises the direct market, it ended a lot of publishers. So it's like,
Well,
you know,
one of among the things to keep in mind, well, right now, by the way, I assume you're aware
Diamond.
right now
Yeah, yeah,
about
Yeah.
well, no, it's reorganizing
yeah.
to meet the challenge, and it's a huge challenge. Interestingly, it people say, well, what killed Buyer's Guide? And people suggested that it was eBay. Uh, you could take online ads, and you didn't need Buyer's Guide to sell your old comics. So our classified ads section dwindled. But what really killed it was, frankly, the monopoly of Diamond.
Hmm.
Because once you have one distributor, you don't need Buyer's Guide to advertise your product. You take an ad in previews, and you're bigger bang for your buck.
Hmm.
It has all the information, and you're not. So we would reach out. So we did the IADD, the International Association of Direct Distributors, and we
Yeah.
would do that listing. So, hey, comic shops, you can check these distributors and see which ones you like. And then, hey, customer, you might want to ask your shop for these books. Well, that both went away right
Hmm.
away.
Did
So
CBR online reporting and stuff like that help kill it too, or
no,
uh oh, it didn't.
it's
Okay.
it's really
Okay.
those two things. It's really
Okay.
those.
Because see, I was never in it for the advertising, even though I'm sure
Right,
that's what I should have
right.
been doing. I was mainly in it for the articles, it's like I'd read Tony's tips and everything else. So, you
Exactly.
know,
Peter David had a column, Mark Evanier had a column,
yeah.
et cetera, Pat Ironwood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, we had wonderful writers, and in fact, I just revisited it this morning. What was I looking for? Oh, I Brant found a photograph of our staff in it was our anniversary. I think it was our 20th anniversary. Anyway, whatever the anniversary was, I just got the photo and I go, I don't even remember who all these people are that worked on our stuff. But then I went back and found the issue. The front cover of the issue in which that photograph appeared was done by Sergio.
Hmm.
I mean, Sergio Aragones did our cover for that celebratory issue. And I mean, how lucky is that? Yeah. And no, it's not there now. So if you think, well, what is it? The one thing that's true and will always be true is this is not, you know, this is not going to last forever.
Yeah.
So you kind of do.
Is there ever a chance, I say rolling my eyes, but is there ever a chance that like some sort of best of or historical book about Comic Buyer's Guide, since it was around for what, 40, 50 years, or something like that,
Yeah, like
Uh
Alter Ego's done giant collections of stuff.
yeah,
Like,
because I mean, I know probably, I don't know how the copyright works on stuff like that. Certain articles probably are owned by the person who wrote it, so they may not give permission. But I mean, but could there be another book out there, and would you be involved in it if that's the case?
Just, I would be glad to help, but you have just nailed the situation.
Yeah,
When
that's what.
we joined,
Oh, oh no, come on, we
look at
frozen.
Siegel and Schuster.
Say that again. I'm
They
sorry, you kind of froze up
look,
there for a second.
I said, look at Siegel and Schuster.
Yeah,
They lost all rights to their creation of Superman.
right.
No one is going to want to provide all, not the high class writers we and artists we want. No.
Yeah,
And Chet said, oh, well, gosh, if somebody sells something to Numismatic News, we just buy all rights. And I said, and he said, all they have to do is change a word here or there, and they'll have ownership of what they've done. And we said, oh, if Coin World magazine re- did one of those articles and just changed a but to a nevertheless and whatever, you wouldn't sue? And Chet said, oh.
Yeah.
So what we came up with, what I came up with, what I sold the company on and got criticized for years later when somebody else took over the publications, was we bought two rights. One was one-time rights, and one was perpetual but non-exclusive rights.
Mm.
So perpetual but non-exclusive rights meant we could print it, but they could print what they'd done. So we never did exclusive one-time rights
Yeah.
or exclusive all, forever rights, all rights. And then the one-time rights, we paid a penny a word less.
Mm.
So Peter David, Mark Evanier, the names, that's one-time rights.
And Mark
No,
Evanier did, I think, didn't Mark Evanier publish a couple of books of his comics book?
yeah, at least one, at least
Yeah.
one. Yep.
Another on
And
his website.
Peter David did.
Yeah.
But I digress. He and the cover on that was anyway. Yeah. So yeah. And but in terms of reprinting everything, no. And by the way, I have a lot of fun just finding that celebratory issue and going, my gosh, this is a really good article. Oh, this is a fascinating thing. Wow, what an interesting take. And then
I
Dan Weber, Dan Weber did a strip for the Madison student newspaper, and we Adventure, and so we reprinted that, and again, and paid him, et cetera, et cetera. So Weber, the portrait of my son that's hanging on the wall there is by Dan Weber, who did the Adventure comic strip that we ran, et cetera.
Most of y'all are aware of the database Quack, Kwakk, right?
No.
.info. It's a search engine of fanzines of all the comic fanzines in the
Okay.
world, and you can just search it. Some of them you can search them and read the whole issue. Some of them you cannot. Like Comics Journal, they don't let you read the whole issue because obviously it's owned by Fantagraphics. So you only can search it page by page, and it'll give you whatever article. And then some of them, like cartoonist profiles, you can read the whole thing.
Okay.
It's yeah, and it's really interesting to read.
Cool. No, I did not know about it. I have now
Yeah.
written it down, as you could
Yeah.
tell.
I was gonna upload my Harveyville Fun Times, but I did scans so far back. I want to rescan them if I do it. Because if I'm gonna bother having it up there for everybody to read, I don't want it to be like your microfiche problem where you can't see anything. You know.
Right.
So
And
so
in fact, I'm donating because I got these. Um, I'm trying to get libraries to take the microfiche because I got multiple microfiches of some of this stuff, and Karen's going to get them for Columbia University, which is one of the great collections. At some point, you guys need to do a listing of every single scholarly collection. So
I I know
Randy Scott started it, and
I
Billy Ireland took over for et cetera. But yeah, we did a listing at one point. There were like 10.
Randy Scott, Lilly has been collecting comics since the early 70s. Like they have like if you look at I always tell don't the Lilly owns comics because that's mainly a rare book library. They have no idea. And I'm the comics person. I'm the only one who knows about comics in the whole building. So I'm like, yeah, look behind you. And on their mural right next to Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven is Spider-Man from the first on the mural is Spider-Man from Amazing Fantasy 15. I'm like, yeah, look right behind you. Right. Yeah. Like the Lilies is limited to comic art mass, but I'm looking at Randy Scott's thing and they're like it says they mainly collect EC comics. I'm like, well, we own every EC comic, but that's not entirely true. I think that's just what the Lily ended up with at that point.
Okay.
Also, when I did my article, like writing about the history, I'm like, man, this list is really outdated. It hadn't been updated since I was about 3 years old, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's one of the things that, so I have an inventory of every comic book that I have that Brent, my buddy, is occasionally adding to. If I don't have it, I want it. That doesn't mean I'm going to read it, and I don't, I mean, yeah. So I actually have a photograph of myself reading, I think it's Comic Capers. And Michelle Nolan, who's a collector, found a copy for me. And so I have a photograph of myself at age, again, 4, reading a comic
Yeah.
book. And yeah, so I
Can I
got that.
ask you both as collectors something? Can I ask you both as collectors and buyers and historians something?
Okay.
All right. As someone who's buying comic books all the time, I also read them. I never will understand the purpose of slabbing things. Like,
No, buying and selling. That
Yeah.
is the
yeah,
only reason to slab. That is the only reason. It was why it was created.
Yeah.
And I actually sat down with Bickford. No, anyway, one of the original CGC spokespeople, and sat down at Comic Con with him. And I said, "This is a stupid idea." And it wasn't Bickford, Borak, Steve Borak. And I said, "This is idiotic." And he said, "No, because what's happening is dealers are selling something as near mint and it's in poor condition. And you need to have a grading setup that says what you're buying is what you're paying for." And
yeah,
that was the original idea. And at one point, they even talked to sending out free uh, crackers that where you could break seal so you could read the freaking comic book. The
That I
whole
didn't
thing
know.
was lying on the
Yeah.
part of the seller
Yeah.
so that the customer doesn't know what he's getting. And then it morphed.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
then and so well, here we are. But I have some as samples because I
Yeah.
like to take them places, but I want a comic book. Basically, ideally, if it's a golden age comic book, I'd like something that's like a 3.
Yeah.
Just
yeah.
beat to hell, but I want to read it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, again, speak among yourselves, and yes, I know we're now really running into time, but too
Well,
bad for
well,
this is
I'll answer
this
the
is from
question.
this
Yeah.
is from Free Comic Book Day from last year. Just
Okay.
saying.
In
I,
my case,
I,
I don't buy them, but
I've,
I understand their use. If you have a pristine copy of, say, Amazing Fantasy 15, we'll use that.
yeah,
It's a good storage holder for it. It's not going to get further damage unless you drop something on it or
I
something.
get it.
Yeah, so
I personally refuse to buy anything worth that much money. I'm like,
well,
this
yeah.
is
I
like,
mean,
I feel like I'm
Maggie's
gonna
right.
get
It really is
scabbed.
buying and selling unless you're having whatever the Snoopy thing is.
Now,
Oh,
what this was Free Comic Book Day last year.
yeah,
And you'll see it's a 9.8,
right,
and it even has a Free Comic Book Day label on it.
right.
And what it was priced at the comic shop like so. Please donate $40
Hmm,
for the Hero Initiative, which helps support
Yeah,
comics creators in need. And I
mhm.
said, heck yeah.
That's
A,
yeah,
kind of fun to have a 9.8, but B, of course I'll donate $40
yeah,
to
what
help
people
people.
have been doing right now though is they've been like, what I've been seeing online is that every time a facsimile, DC produces a facsimile, someone
Sure.
slabs it.
yeah. That's
And
kind of
what
silly.
they've been doing is they've been slabbing them. And Mark, you and I have discussed this because I've sent you that they're selling $2,000 slabs of like the last like a facsimile of Superman from 4 years ago.
Yeah.
I'm like, what are you doing?
Well, it's just the famous first edition thing phenomenon all
Oh
over
yeah,
again, where they
where
just
they
took out
cut
the
it out.
outer cover and just sold the
Yeah, they
original.
cut
Oh,
out the
comics
outer.
were
Yeah,
bigger back then, just like,
The only reason for slabbing is between a buyer and a seller to say, yes, this is what I say it is. And beyond that, nah.
yeah,
And so
but
again, so I go to heritage auctions all the time. I really like going there, but I don't buy slabbed stuff
yeah,
yeah,
because no. But
heritage. I'll say this about heritage auctions. I was like, I've been looking for jobs, and I was like, how much does heritage auctions pay? And I looked at the review. And I'm like, oh no, uh-uh. The very first review of heritage auctions as an employer said, someone says, is what? Then when asked the question, it was like, what do you do? Where do you go? How long do you have to work until you can get maternity leave? And the answer that some random person gave is, you as a parent
yeah.
deserve better.
Stick with libraries. They usually pay better. Yeah.
bad mouthing anybody in this podcast, shame on you, because you don't know what the circumstances are and you don't know who offended whom. So,
Yeah.
So anyway, I have had very good luck. One of the
I
weird
have
things that
two.
I found out in selling things through Heritage, one of the things that I found was if people aren't looking for it, they're not going to look to buy it.
That's what
And
my luck has been too.
yeah,
My
so you
my
can get
luck
it
is
cheap if nobody else is looking for it.
my I've bought stuff in really good deals from Heritage Auctions because no one else was wanting it.
Yeah.
That's what I'm
I
saying.
found that, but if you're looking for animation art, always go for background art. I bought some cells from Heritage Auctions, and the reason nobody wanted it was because of the pose. They wanted something that looks nice on the wall. I'm like, I don't care about that. I want people to show that somebody worked on something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah.
All right. Well, Camden, do you have any other questions before we kind of wrap it up here?
No, my only
Uh,
added was that the reason I asked this is because someone in the group said, "Well, I don't really care what's inside. I just care about the cover." And I'm like, the art isn't just in the cover.
well, then you can go to Grand Comics database. All the covers are there.
Just print it out.
Yeah, print it out.
Absolutely. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, if you don't like picture stories, what are you doing as a comics collector?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, what the
Um,
heck?
I guess my last question for Maggie here before we let you go is, I know you're working on the Pogo thing. You showed that. What else are you working on, and any personal appearances or anything else going on in the next few months?
Go to Comic Con every year because they are wonderful to me, and I love Comic Con, and you never know what's going to happen at Comic Con. And in
Yeah.
fact, I will amaze you with
I'll
okay.
be there
So
next year
what
too.
else am I working on? I do a weekly column for Scoop from
Mhm.
Diamond. We'll see what happens on that. But basically, it's the anniversaries 5 year, 10 year, 15 year, 20 year. And by the way, we're coming up on I think it's the 90th anniversary of the first American comic book with all original uh, content, just so you know.
Okay.
But so last year at Comic Con, where my daughter and her son and I are sitting at a table actually across an aisle from Mark Evanier, and Mark calls me over after his partner has left the person he's having breakfast with has left the table. And Mark said, just so you know, he has a table, this guy has a table at Comic Con, and you should check it out because he is now the Mad magazine leading caricaturist.
Mm.
With Tom Richmond.
Yes. And so I went by the table that day, and I said, "So what do you do?" And what he does is he'll take photos, and you'll say, "Okay, I'll buy a caricature that you will do for me." And
I did it. I
okay,
did it
then
too.
then my daughter dissolved in laughter. It is not flattering, but you could recognize me across a room.
Yeah,
Now,
mine is too.
again, for those poor souls who only
Oh, this is the Tom Richmond original that you
Yeah, mine is
have.
too. Mine has about a neck about this big.
I should get Tom to do mine because, let's see this. Oh, this is great. Aw, that's good. And it's
I
Tom.
can't see it. Oh wait, now I can.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Rewatch the show. You'll see it again. You can pause it. Anyway. Yeah, I've talked to Tom many times, especially for my Mad book,
sure.
Unconditionally Mad Part
Wonderful.
One and Part B. I'll plug it here. Anyway, but I've never asked him to do one for me, and I should probably have him do one for me. So
Should.
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
Mark, Tom did this thing where it was like if you buy his book, automatic. If you buy the book, you pay a little extra money, you'd get your face drawn in the book.
Oh, okay.
Where he did
Yeah,
was like,
yeah.
and I did that.
Oh, okay. I bought his book in the store, so silly me. And for some reason, I've never, it's funny. I've looked on his website to try to buy original artwork, and some things I thought, maybe that, and I was too late on one of them. He did Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and I said, "Ooh, I want one of those," but somebody bought that. But to get myself as a caricature, I didn't even think about that, but I will now, because I've had Tom on the show and everything else. I'm surprised he didn't push it. I could do one of yours, Anyway. All right.
right.
Any last words, Maggie, before we go?
We're having fun, guys. So have a delightful weekend. I now
Yeah.
have a Zoom. What's my Zoom? In a bit.
Okay.
I'm an Eisner Hall of Fame judge, and so we meet this afternoon to talk about the next category.
Okay.
So, yep, there we go.
All
What's great.
right.
And I learn because somebody will say, "Oh, have you know?" Yeah, I mean, you're always learning about something, as you guys know.
Yes.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Oh, yay,
All right.
knowledge.
All right. Well, you learned about that website with all the fanzines. That's an excellent resource. So
Quack,
yes, definitely look at that.
It's
KWAKK.
been it's been I've told people like, this is not just for comics people, science fiction and animation fans, you should be reading because it's basically the same magazines.
Right, right.
Okay. So they're doing all fancies? What?
They'll do any
All
fanzines. Like I said, I
all
asked
comic
them.
fanzines,
Yeah,
but they cross-pollinate.
Got it.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, well, like Zero with All in Color for a Dime to
Right.
bring us
Yeah.
full circle.
There we go.
Ooh,
All right. Well, I want to thank you, Maggie Thompson, for being our special guest, and Kamden Spies. It's always a pleasure having you on the show. And this wraps it up for another episode of Fun Ideas Podcast, and we will see you next time.